Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine you're living right at the very dawn of organized civilization.
Right. Cities are new. Writing is just being invented.
And you look around at these incredible, sometimes frankly terrifying forces of nature. How do you even begin to explain it all?
The sky, the earth, those
And
rivers.
exactly. The Tigris and Euphrates giving life one minute, taking it all away the next. What kind of gods would you even imagine, and why?
Well, that fundamental human quest for explanation, that's exactly what we're diving into today. We've got this source material that takes us right back.
To one of the earliest recorded belief systems we know of, ancient Sumerian mythology.
It really is a treasure trove. It's like a window into the very first big attempts to understand the universe.
So our mission here in this deep dive is really to be your guides. We're going to try and pull out the most important bits of knowledge from this source.
Yeah, help you get a handle on the core of it, all the gods, the myths, their unique view of the world.
Without you having to wade through, deciphering clay tablets yourself.
So just to set the scene a bit, we're talking about Sumer, southern Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq.
And this is way back, late 4th millennium BCE, roughly.
These people were amazing pioneers. I mean, among the very first to build cities, invent writing that cuneiform script.
The wheel, massive temples, organized religion as we start to recognize it.
And the source makes this really crucial point right off the bat. Their environment shaped everything, their beliefs.
Living right there by Tigris and Euphrates, it meant these cycles, didn't it? Unpredictable, sometimes violent floods.
But also life-giving irrigation, that constant tension, creation, and destruction side by side.
Bounty and devastation. The source says this duality is absolutely key. It just permeated their whole worldview, how they saw the gods.
And how we know this? Well, it comes from thousands of these clay tablets they left behind.
Hymns, prayers, epic stories, even just lists of gods, right?
Exactly. Plus what archaeologists have found. The ruins of their huge temples, the ziggurats.
And all that intricate art on cylinder seals and statues.
So yeah, get ready. We're going to get a huge pantheon of gods, uncover some pretty surprising creation stories.
Delve into why they thought humans were here, the rules they believed governed existence.
And explore some really fascinating, sometimes quite grim, stories they told about it all.
Okay, let's start with that foundational worldview then, because the source really hammers home how their environment, those rivers, weren't just, background scenery.
No, not at all. It was completely woven into how they understood the divine.
Right. Living there, relying on those unpredictable rivers, they saw the gods as totally intertwined with the world, with human life.
Every flood, every harvest, every illness or success.
It was all linked back to the gods. Nothing was separate.
And their society was built around these powerful city-states. Uruk, Erdu, Nippur.
And each city had its own main god, its patron deity.
That's right. And the temple, the ziggurat, it wasn't just for praying. The source highlights it as the economic hub, the political center, and the spiritual heart of the city, all in one.
So while they shared a big pantheon of gods overall...
Yeah, who was considered most important could definitely vary depending on which city you were in.
And what a pantheon! The source describes it as just vast, hierarchical, and I find this fascinating, deeply anthropomorphic. Human-like.
Totally. These weren't distant, perfect beings. They had emotions, virtues, but also fierce tempers, big flaws. They loved, hated, argued.
Made mistakes, got jealous, schemed.
It sounds incredibly, well, relatable, even thousands of years later.
It absolutely does. And right at the top you have the Anunnaki. They're often described as the sort of senior council, the most powerful ruling gods.
Like On, the Sky Father. The ultimate authority figure linked to kingship, often shown with that horned crown.
But the source notes he was maybe a bit distant. Supreme authority, yes, but perhaps less involved in the day-to-day stuff compared to others.
Right. Unlike, say, Enlil, Lord of the Wind and Storm, his domain was the atmosphere, the air, the space between heaven and earth.
And he was often seen as the effective boss of the Pantheon, the enforcer. He's credited with separating heaven and earth in the creation story.
But also the one who unleashed the Great Flood. He really embodies that Sumerian duality we mentioned.
How so? Controlling the breath of life, but also...
Exactly. But also the devastating storms. Life and destruction in one figure.
Okay, but why? Why have this god who's both creator and destroyer? What does that tell us about how they saw things?
I think it just reflects the raw reality of their environment. The wind and rain could be gentle, nourishing, or a terrifying destructive force.
So Enlil's power over that made him both essential and, well, scary.
Definitely. And crucially, he held the tablets of destiny, the me. These were like the divine blueprints for reality. Holding them gave him immense power.
And then there's Enki, Lord of Earth and Waters, specifically the Abzu, that's the freshwater ocean under the earth, right?
Exactly. The source of rivers and springs. Enki's the god of wisdom, magic, crafts, creation. Often shown with water flowing around him, maybe fish.
He sounds quite different from Enlil.
Oh, very different, often. The source calls him beloved, active, a benefactor, a protector. He's the clever one, the problem solver.
The one who organized the world after creation, and sometimes involved in making humans.
That's him. His city, Eridu, was supposedly one of the oldest. He's often portrayed as, well, much more approachable than Enlil.
So you've got this powerful, sometimes terrifying Enlil, and then the wise, maybe more helpful Enki, that duality again, even right at the top.
Precisely. It's not just a list of names. These gods represent different forces, different aspects of life as the Sumerians experienced it. Enki is maybe the cunning, life-giving aspect.
While Enlil is the raw power, the order, but also the potential for chaos.
You got it. And alongside them, Ninhursag, the great mother goddess, linked to the earth, fertility, childbirth, mountains.
She often pops up in creation stories too, especially making humans. And her name changes, like Ninma or Nintu, depending on the role.
Exactly. Reflects her different functions as this paramount mother figure.
Okay, moving down from that top tier. Who else is major? Celestial gods.
Definitely. Inanna, the moon god. Very revered, associated with wisdom, timekeeping, cattle. His main city was
And his children were important too.
Very.
Who?
Utu, the sun god. Because he sees everything from the sky, he became closely linked with justice, truth, law. The divine judge, in a way.
And Utu's sister, Inanna. Wow. Also known as Ishtar later on. The source makes her sound incredibly significant.
Oh, she's huge. One of the most complex, widely worshipped deities. Goddess of love, fertility, but also war and political power.
Talk about contradictions.
Totally embodies them. Passionate, ambitious, but also ruthless. Life-giving, but destructive. Her symbol is the 8-pointed star that's the planet Venus.
She sounds like a real force of nature herself.
Absolutely, a central dynamic figure. And her consort was Dumuzid, the shepherd god.
Linked to vegetation, the seasons?
Yes, exactly. Their relationship and his death and potential return are key to myths explaining the natural cycles of growth and decay.
The source also mentions the gods of the underworld, Kur or Urkala. Sounds pretty grim.
It was. Ruled by Ereshkigal, who happens to be Inanna's sister. A formidable, rather terrifying figure.
And later joined by Nergal, god of plague and war. Cheery place.
Not exactly. And you also have figures like Ninurta, Enlil's son, a heroic warrior god involved in fighting monsters, but also linked to agriculture.
So beyond these big names, there were loads of others. Lesser gods, spirits.
A whole host. Younger gods called the Igigi, and a fascinating array of demons and spirits. Some nasty ones like the Gala who drag people to the underworld, or the monster Asag, or Lamashtu who preyed on mothers and infants.
Yikes. But also protective ones?
Yeah, figures like Pazuzu who, although fearsome looking, could actually ward off other evil spirits. Yep. And then there were personal gods.
Like guardian angels?
Sort of. An intermediary, a personal protector for an individual. So even the average person felt they had some kind of divine connection, someone looking out for them specifically.
Okay, so with this huge, complex family of gods, how did the Sumerians think the universe itself, got started and was put together?
Well, the source is clear. There isn't just one single story like in some later religions. But there are definitely common themes that pop up again and again in different myths.
It usually starts with water. Like a formless abyss.
Exactly. A primordial, watery chaos, sometimes called Namu, the primeval mother.
Yeah.
And out of this came An Heaven and Ki Earth. But initially, they were all stuck together.
And this is where Enlil comes in again, the separator.
He's the one. He forcefully pries them apart and arches up to become the heavens above. Ki becomes the flat disk of the earth below.
And Enlil takes charge of the space between them, the atmosphere, the lil, the wind.
That's his domain. That separation is the fundamental act of creation, making the physical world they knew.
Then the sky gets populated. The moon, Lana, born from Enlil and Ninlil.
And then Nana has Utu, the sun, and Inanna, Venus.
So the heavens are set up. What about ordering the earth itself?
That's where Enki really shines. There are myths like Enki and the world order that describe him basically going around setting things up.
Like assigning jobs to the other gods, making the land fertile.
Yes, establishing the rules, the functions, making sure civilization could actually work. He's the great organizer.
So if you were to draw it, what did their universe look like? The source describes it as kind of layered.
Yeah, think of it like this. Way up top, on the highest heavens, home of the great gods.
Below that key, the flat disk of Earth where humans live.
Between them, Lil, the atmosphere, Enlil's realm.
And then under the Earth.
First, the Abzu, that vast freshwater ocean, Enki's domain, the source of all springs and rivers, crucial for life.
And beneath that.
Yakala, the underworld, dark, dusty, the land of the dead ruled by Ereshkigal.
So a universe not just in layers, but filled with divine power and presence at every level.
And right there on that flat Earth disk key, you have humans. Their creation story is absolutely central, and the source makes the Sumerian reason for it starkly clear.
Humans were created. Why? Not out of love or...
No, to serve the gods, period.
Serve them how?
Specifically to do the manual labor. The farming, digging canals, building temples, making offerings, all the hard work the gods themselves found, well, tiresome.
So the gods basically outsourced the chores.
Pretty much. Later myths like Atrahasis really explore this, the gods complaining about the workload and deciding to make humans to take over.
And the creators are usually Enki and Ninhursag.
They're the key players, yeah. Often, Enki has the clever idea, maybe provides the divine spark.
And Ninhursag does the actual shaping from clay.
Usually clay from the Abzu, yes. Sometimes mixed with something divine, like the blood or spit of a sacrificed god.
Why add that?
To give humans perhaps a sliver of divine essence, intelligence, maybe just the ability to understand orders, or perhaps even the capacity to suffer and toil. It's fashioned with divine magic, incantations.
So not created in God's image or for companionship, but explicitly as a workforce. That's quite a view of our purpose.
It is pretty stark, isn't it? It really emphasizes their view of human dependency, human subservience. Life for early humans, in their myths, was basically hard labor for capricious bosses.
Okay, so if the gods set up the cosmos and created humans to work it, what held everything together? What were the rules? That brings us to the Tablets of Destiny, the Me.
Right, the Me, M-E. This is one of the most interesting, maybe abstract, but absolutely vital concepts the source talks about.
They're not just rules, are they? More like powers, attributes.
Exactly. The source describes them as divine decrees, the fundamental principles, powers, technologies, skills, and cultural norms that governed everything. The cosmos, society, civilization itself.
Everything. Like what sort of things?
I mean, everything. From big concepts like kingship, justice, heroism, victory, peace, down to practical things like writing, weaving, metalwork, farming, music, even emotions like fear, strife, joy. They were all embodied in the Me.
Wow. So they're basically the divine operating system for reality and society.
That's a great way to put it. And whoever held the Maid had immense power, control over order and existence. Initially, they belonged to the top gods like Enlil or An.
But the source mentions a famous story about how they changed hands, involving Inanna and Enki.
Ah, yes, the myth of Inanna acquiring the Me. It's a classic. Inanna, always ambitious, wanting to boost the status of her city, Uruk.
She goes to visit Enki in his city, Eridu.
Right, and there's a feast, lots of beer, and she manages to get Enki completely drunk.
And while he's intoxicated, she gets the Me off him. How?
The details vary, but basically she either charms him, tricks him, or he drunkenly offers them to her. She gets her hands on over 100 of these divine powers.
100? What does she do then?
She loads them onto her boat of heaven and makes a quick getaway back to Uruk.
Does Enki try to stop her when he sobers up?
Oh, yeah. He sends various creatures and demons after her to retrieve them, but Inanna, with help, manages to fight them off and arrives back in Uruk triumphant, bringing all that divine power and prestige to her city.
So it's not just a story about Inanna being clever or tricky.
No, it's much bigger. It symbolizes a shift in cultural importance, maybe reflecting Uruk's rise. It shows Inanna's ambition, her power, and also, maybe, that even the wise Enki isn't infallible, that power can shift in unexpected ways.
Right, let's get into some of those big stories now. The myths and epics that really show these gods and concepts in action.
And you really can't talk Sumerian myths without touching on the origins of the Epic of Gilgamesh.
The really famous one that started here.
Absolutely. The later Akkadian version is the most complete, but the source confirms it grew out of earlier, separate Sumerian poems about Gilgamesh, the legendary king of Uruk.
Like Gilgamesh and Huwawa fighting the monster in the cedar forest.
That one. And Gilgamesh and the Bull of Heaven, where he and Enkidu anger Inanna, or the really bleak one, Gilgamesh and Enkidu in the netherworld, which gives a grim picture of the afterlife.
So those core themes, heroism, friendship, the search for fame, confronting death, our relationship with the gods, they were all there in these early Sumerian tales.
Definitely laid the groundwork. But maybe one of the most complete and impactful Sumerian myths we have is the descent of Inanna to the underworld.
Okay, this one sounds intense. Inanna decides to go down to Kur, the realm of the dead, ruled by her own sister, Ereshkigal. Why on earth would she do that?
Good question. The source suggests it stems from her huge ambition, maybe to extend her power even over the dead, or just sheer hubris. Whatever the reason, she decides to go.
Does she know it's dangerous?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
She makes careful preparations, dresses in her finest regalia and symbols of power, but also tells her loyal servant, Ninshuber, what to do if she doesn't come back within 3 days, which is seek help from the other major gods.
Smart move. So she goes down. What happens at the gates?
There are 7 gates to the underworld, and at each gate, the gatekeeper forces her to remove one item of her clothing or jewelry, her crown, her beads, her robe.
Stripping away her power with each step.
Exactly. By the time she reaches Ereshkigal's throne room, she's naked, powerless, and vulnerable.
And her sister's not happy to see her.
It's not at all. Ereshkigal fixes her with the Eye of Death, the Anunnaki judges of the underworld condemn her, and Inanna is turned into a corpse, hung on a hook, dead.
Grim. So, how does she get out of that? Is this where Ninshuber comes in?
Yes. Ninshuber does as instructed, goes to Enlil, goes to Nana. They refuse to help, basically saying she brought it on herself.
Harsh.
But then she goes to Enki, and Enki, the clever one, agrees to help. He takes some dirt from under his fingernails and creates 2 special beings, the Kurgara and the Galatura.
What's special about them?
They seem to be asexual, or perhaps outside the normal categories of being, which allows them to enter the underworld unharmed. Enki gives them the food and water of life and tells them to go down and essentially empathize with Ereshkigal.
Empathize with the queen of hell.
Apparently, Ereshkigal is groaning, possibly in labor pains or just misery. The Kurgara and Galatura echo her groans, show sympathy. This pleases Ereshkigal, and she offers them a gift.
And they ask for Inanna's body.
Exactly. They sprinkle it with the food and water of life Enki gave them, and Inanna is resurrected.
Amazing. But there's always a catch with the underworld, isn't there? You can't just leave.
Never. The rule is absolute. If you leave the underworld, someone must take your place. So Inanna ascends, but she's accompanied by the Gala, the terrifying demons of the underworld, whose job it is to drag her substitute back down.
Oh, man.
Who does she choose?
Well, she visits various gods and followers and sees them mourning her properly, dressed in sackcloth. She refuses to let the demons take them. But then she finds her husband, Dumuzid.
The shepherd god.
Right. And he's sitting there on his throne dressed in fine clothes, apparently not mourning her absence, enjoying his status, maybe.
Oh, bad move.
Very bad move. And Anna is furious. She points at him and tells the Gala, take him.
Wow, cold.
And then they seize him. There are bits where he tries to escape, but eventually he's dragged down to become her substitute.
That's intense. And this story then gets linked to the seasons. Yes, especially in later versions focusing on the Tammuz cult, which is Dumuzid's other name. His sister, Geshtina, eventually bargains to share his fate, taking his place in the underworld for half the year.
So his return explains the return of vegetation in the spring.
That's the idea. It connects this divine drama directly to the cycles of nature. This myth is just packed with themes. Ambition, the power of the underworld, death and resurrection, even if temporary, the necessity of sacrifice, grief, the inescapable nature of death, even for gods.
Okay, what about Enki and Ninhursag? The source mentioned this one, set in Dilmun, like a paradise.
Yeah, Dilmun is often depicted as this pure, bright land, initially without sickness or death. But the myth itself is more about, well, creation, transgression, and healing.
Transgression. What does Enki do this time?
Well, in this paradise, he has relations with Ninhursag, then their daughter, then their daughter.
Okay, bit weird. Divine standards, I guess.
And then Ninhursag creates 8 special plants. Enki, curious, decides to eat them all.
Why would he do that?
Maybe just exploring, tasting creation. But Ninhursag is furious. She declares she will never look upon him with the eye of life again, effectively cursing him, and she disappears.
And Enki gets sick.
Terribly sick. 8 parts of his body suffer from ailments, 1 for each plant he ate. The other gods are distraught. Enki is dying. But they can't find Ninhursag.
So who fixes it?
A fox, actually. The fox promises Ninhursag great fame if she helps, and persuades her to return.
And she heals him.
In a really interesting way. She sits beside Enki, asks him, "My brother, where does it hurt?" For each of the 8 aching body parts, she births a new minor deity, specifically designed to heal that part.
Literally birthing the cure. That's amazing. It ties the gods directly to specific illnesses and healing.
Exactly. Shows that interconnectedness again. And it also shows Enki isn't always the perfectly wise god. He can mess up too.
Then there's Enlil and Ninlil. This one sounded like it involved divine wrongdoing too.
It definitely does. It starts with Enlil, maybe as a younger god, seeing the goddess Ninlil bathing in a canal in Nippur.
And he assaults her.
He forces himself on her, yes, rapes her. And for this transgression, the other gods banish him from the city, decreeing he must go to the underworld.
Okay, so there are consequences for the gods sometimes.
There are. But Ninlil, now pregnant with the moon god Inanna, decides to follow Enlil out of loyalty or love, or perhaps because she's also been tainted by the event.
So Nana might be born destined for the underworld.
That seems to be the risk. So Enlil, now in exile, hatches a plan. He encounters Ninlil 3 more times, but each time he's disguised as the gatekeeper of the city, as the man of the underworld river, as the ferryman.
And each time?
He sleeps with her again, fathering 3 more deities. But these are underworld deities.
Why do that?
The idea seems to be that these 3 underworld children act as substitutes, fulfilling the quota for the underworld, allowing the firstborn, Nana, to be free from that fate and ascend to become the bright moon god in the sky.
Wow. So more transgression is used to fix the consequence of the first transgression, all to ensure cosmic order and the moon god's place.
It's a very complex portrayal. It shows the gods operating by different rules, maybe prioritizing the structure of the cosmos over simple human ethics. It gives an origin for Nana and some underworld gods, but paints Enlil in a very ambiguous light.
And finally, the Sumerian flood story, the Ziggurat epic. This sounds incredibly familiar.
It should. As the source points out, is one of the earliest flood myths we have, and a clear forerunner to the story of Noah in Genesis.
So, the basics. Gods decide to wipe out humanity.
Pretty much. The assembly of gods, with Enlil apparently being the main instigator, decides that humans are too noisy, or maybe just too numerous or wicked, and they decree a great flood to destroy them all.
But one god disagrees. Enki again.
Enki, often the friend of humanity. But he's apparently sworn an oath with the other gods not to reveal the plan directly to humans.
So how does he warn anyone?
In a very clever roundabout way, he speaks to the wall of a reed hut where the pious king Ziggurat is living. He tells the wall about the god's plan and instructs the wall to build a boat, tear down the house, and save living things.
Ziggurat overhears this conversation with the wall.
Presumably, he gets the message, builds the boat, and loads it with his family, craftsmen, and the seed of all living things.
And the flood comes.
A terrible deluge, lasting 7 days and 7 nights, covering the earth.
But Ziggurat survives in his boat.
He does. When the waters subside, he opens a window, sees the sun god Utu, and makes a sacrifice, usually sheep and oxen, to the gods.
How do the gods react? Is Enlil angry he survived?
There might have been some initial anger, but ultimately Ziggurat is rewarded for preserving life. He and his wife are granted immortality, or at least exceptionally long life, and sent to live in Dilmun, that paradise land.
So that core story, divine anger, human wickedness or noise, a warning from a sympathetic god, survival in a boat, sacrifice, preservation of life, it was all there right at the start of recorded mythology. That's incredible.
And speaking of the end of life, let's talk about the Sumerian afterlife. The source paints a, well, pretty bleak picture.
Yeah, Kur or Irkalla, the land of no return, dark, dusty, down beneath the Abzu, ruled by Ereshkigal.
And the absolutely crucial point the source emphasizes, everyone went there. All mortals.
Regardless of whether you were good or bad in life, no heaven for the virtuous.
Nope, no judgment based on morality leading to a different destination. Your deeds on earth didn't change your ultimate fate. Everyone ended up in the same grim place.
And what was it like there? The source mentions shadowy spirits.
The Gittim. They were thought to just sort of exist. Eating dust and clay, drinking murky water, living in perpetual darkness and silence. Often, they seem to forget their lives on earth. It sounds incredibly depressing.
Could anything make it better? Or worse?
Well, the living could help, slightly. Providing funerary offerings, pouring out water, leaving food was thought to offer some meager sustenance to the dead spirit.
So if your family forgot about you,
then your existence was even more miserable, and those neglected spirits, the ones without proper burial rites or offerings, might become restless and potentially return to haunt the living, causing trouble.
So the focus wasn't on earning a good afterlife through good deeds.
Not at all. It was much more pragmatic. The focus was on ensuring the spirit reached the underworld properly and was kept relatively content there so it wouldn't bother you up here.
That really highlights a different way of thinking about death. It's unavoidable, it's grim, and the main goal is just managing it peacefully for both sides.
Exactly. Proper burial, ongoing remembrance through offerings, these were vital social and religious duties, not for heavenly reward, but for maintaining order between the living and the dead.
Given how central the gods were to, well, everything,
Wow.
it makes sense their religious practices were really organized.
But highly organized, deeply embedded in society. The source describes the temples, the ziggurats, as the absolute heart of the city.
We picture them as those massive stepped pyramids.
That's right. But they weren't just places for people to gather and worship like a modern church or mosque. They were seen as the actual house of the patron god or goddess.
The god literally lived there.
In the shrine at the very top, yes.
Yeah.
That was the idea. And the temple complex wasn't just religious. It was a huge economic engine.
How so?
They owned vast amounts of land, employed huge numbers of people, priests, administrators, farmers, craftspeople. They controlled storage of grain, distribution of goods. They were major administrative centers, too.
So the Ziggurat complex was like the city hall, the main bank, and the cathedral all rolled into one.
That's a pretty good analogy, yeah. Reaching up towards the heavens, but deeply rooted in the practical life of the city.
And the priesthood running all this must have been complex, too.
Very hierarchical. The source mentions the En, the high priest or priestess, a very important role, often a royal appointee, basically managing the god's household and rituals at the top level.
Any other interesting priestly roles?
Well, there were the Gala priests. They seem to have been specialists in music and singing lamentations, particularly connected with the mourning rites for gods like Dumuzid or for city destruction. And as some texts describe them in ways that suggest they might have been eunuchs or androgynous, occupying a kind of third gender space, particularly linked to Inanna.
Fascinating. And what about daily life in the temple?
Daily rituals were crucial. It involved waking the god's statue in the shrine, washing it, clothing it, providing meals twice a day, burning incense, pouring libations, basically attending to the god's needs to keep them happy and maintain the relationship.
And big festivals, too, I assume.
Oh, yes. Major festivals tied to the agricultural calendar, planting, harvesting, or celestial events, or celebrating key moments in their mythology, like the dramatic mourning for Dumuzid's descent to the underworld.
And the source mentioned a sacred marriage ritual.
The Hieros Gamos, a very significant ritual, especially in cities like Uruk. The king, representing the god Dumuzid, would ritually unite with the high priestess, representing the goddess Inanna.
Why? What's the point?
To ensure fertility and prosperity for the entire land. It was a symbolic act meant to magically guarantee good harvests, healthy livestock, and the continuation of life for the community. It directly linked the human ruler to the divine forces of creation.
And they tried to figure out the gods' plans, too. Divination.
Absolutely essential. They believed the gods sent signs, omens in the natural world, so they developed complex methods to interpret them. Examining the livers of sacrificed sheep was a big one.
Liver reading.
Seriously?
Hepatoscopy, yes. They saw specific markings and features on the liver as messages. Also, reading patterns of oil dropped on water or interpreting the shapes made by incense smoke. All ways to try and understand the divine will or predict the future.
And they wrote lots of hymns and laments.
A very rich literary tradition. Beautiful hymns praising the gods, but also powerful lamentations, mourning personal tragedies, or, very commonly, the destruction of their cities by enemies or disaster, seeing it as abandonment by their patron god.
Okay, so if we pull back and look at the whole picture, what are the big takeaways, the key themes that really stand out from this deep dive into the source?
Well, the source consistently highlights a few major themes. One is definitely that struggle between order and chaos. The gods creating structure versus the primordial chaos, or monsters.
And the nature of the gods themselves. Yeah, their immense power, but also their capriciousness. Being anthropomorphic, they were relatable, but also unpredictable. Sometimes irrational or unjust from a human perspective.
Which leads to the human condition.
Exactly. Human frailty and dependence. Being created specifically to serve, being fundamentally reliant on these powerful, unpredictable deities for survival.
And that stark view of death, the inevitability of death leading to that grim, inescapable afterlife for absolutely everyone. No exceptions based on merit.
Right. There's also the importance of civilization represented by the me, the idea that culture, laws, crafts, they all had divine origins. They were gifts to be maintained.
And everything felt connected.
Deeply. That interconnectedness of the divine, nature, and human society,
Mm.
what happened in one realm directly affected the others. Human actions could anger gods, natural disasters were divine acts.
Is there any sense of justice, though? Or morality?
There was an incipient sense, yes. Utu, the sun god, was associated with justice. Kings were supposed to uphold justice. But it wasn't a fully formed ethical system tied to an afterlife reward like in some later religions. Justice was more about maintaining earthly order.
And the legacy. How did all this influence what came later?
Profoundly. Sumerian religion heavily influenced all subsequent Mesopotamian cultures. The Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians. They adopted and adapted the gods.
Like Inanna becoming Ishtar, Enki becoming Ea.
Precisely. Syncretism. They translated and expanded Sumerian myths, like the creation and flood stories, which formed the basis for epics like the Babylonian Enuma Elish.
And the source mentioned parallels beyond Mesopotamia, like with the Bible.
Yes, some really striking parallels that suggest either indirect influence through shared cultural heritage or maybe just similar human responses to universal questions.
The creation of humans from clay.
Echoes of a paradise myth like Dilmun.
The flood story, Zisudra and Noah, is unmistakable.
Yeah. Possible thematic parallels between lamentation texts and the Book of Job. Even early Sumerian law codes like Ur-Nammu's having principles similar to later Mosaic law, though that's law, not mythology itself.
So these foundational stories and archetypes, the dying grazing god like Dumuzid, the heroic quest, the powerful mother goddess, they seem to have filtered out into the wider Near East and maybe even the Mediterranean.
It seems very likely. And of course, the rediscovery of Sumer itself, the decipherment of cuneiform of the 19th century, that just opened up this incredible, previously unknown chapter of human history.
A glimpse into the very dawn of complex thought, religion, literature.
Absolutely. But studying it isn't easy. The source reminds us the evidence is fragmentary broken tablets. The Sumerian language is an isolate, hard to translate perfectly. Beliefs changed over centuries and differed between cities.
And it's hard to untangle purely Sumerian ideas from the later Akkadian and Babylonian layers they got mixed with.
Exactly. It's an ongoing process of discovery and interpretation. Still lots we're learning.
So, wow, we've really covered some ground here. From those top-tier Anunnaki gods, like the powerful Enlil and the clever Enki, and the incredibly complex Inanna.
Through their ideas about how the universe was structured, why humans were created basically for labor.
The me, those fundamental rules governing everything, and how Inanna managed to snag them.
All those amazing myths, Gilgamesh's origins, Inanna's terrifying trip to the underworld, the flood.
And down into that really quite bleak view of the afterlife, Kur, the land of no return.
These weren't just stories they told for fun. This was their framework, their operating system for making sense of everything.
The forces of nature, why society was the way it was, what it meant to be human, life, death.
And as the source shows so vividly, these incredibly early beliefs, the first ones we have written down in such detail, they really did lay groundwork, ideas and archetypes that echoed down through millennia.
Sometimes faintly, sometimes really strikingly, in cultures and religions that came thousands of years later.
It's like a journey to the absolute roots of our shared civilizational story. Right back to the beginning of humanity's big, organized attempt to figure out the universe and where we fit in it all.
So here's a final thought to leave you with, drawing on what we've seen in the source. Considering how fundamental these stories were, serving unpredictable gods, living with that environmental uncertainty, and facing this grim, inescapable afterlife that good deeds couldn't change, what does that tell us about the core hopes and fears of people right at the start of civilization?
And maybe, how much of that ancient struggle, that search for meaning in a world that often feels chaotic or indifferent, still resonates with us today?